Well, first off, it's good to be back here in my hometown, and glad to see old friends like Monty and Jared, and Don, Jerry, and Dave, and everyone else here who's come out to hear Tom. And I just want to tell you a little bit about why I'm supporting Tom. Yeah, I worked for Ron Paul's campaign a few years ago, and worked for Ted Cruz most recently. Hey, Garrett, good to see you there. And now I'm working for Tom, because Tom's got the same type of bold, courageous character to stand on principle, even when he's facing political tailwinds. And he's got that throughout his entire career, whether it's starting with the Goldwater campaign in college, or serving in Vietnam as a veteran, or in the Reagan administration when he headed a federal agency. Tom also is a businessman. As mentioned, he's a Reaganite and a veteran. He's also a family man. He's married to his wife, the former Ayala. He's got 7 children, 14 grandchildren. So Tom's definitely the type of guy that knows how to run a big organization.
That's my wife, Josh.
Well, he knows how to delegate. So, anyway, I don't want to take too much time. I just want to introduce Tom Pauken.
Thank you very much. Thanks all of you for coming, and we have little musical chairs here tonight going from one place to another, but we all got here. Appreciate that, Josh, and thanks for your involvement in this effort. I don't need to tell this group we're dealing with the most liberal regime in American history in the Obama administration. There's a funny feeling out there, and my sense is that at the grassroots level, the people that are older like myself or younger like many of you here, you sense we're losing the country, we're sliding downward, and I have a feeling that people are well ahead of the career politicians in sensing the seriousness of the moment and what we must do to begin to put the left back on the defensive again. I have been out of government since leaving the Reagan administration. I chaired the Texas Republican Party back when we took it from the sort of the top-down political consultant, Karl Rove-driven bunch who love to manipulate the conservatives, divide libertarians and traditionalists in order to allow for, if you will, a group of top-down elitists to run our party who had no deeply seated set of principles. We took them on, we won, but the sad phenomenon is that we're back in a situation where we've got state government that's top-down. We've got a bunch of people that say all the right things. They read the scripts. They know what the pollsters tell them to say. The political consultants write the words out. But the reality is things don't get better, they get worse. We're always on the defensive. We're allowing the left to frame the debate, and we can turn this thing around. I've been part of a movement that's done it before, and some of you know me, but let me take a few minutes to talk a little about my background. I went off to Georgetown University, and I'd read a few books, The Road to Serfdom by F.A. Hayek, Up from Liberalism by Bill Buckley, The Conscience of a Conservative by Barry Goldwater. And I became part of a Goldwater movement in the early 1960s. Let me tell you, everybody claims to be a conservative today. There weren't many people claiming to be a conservative back then. And to be frank, I thought I was joining the losing side, but I felt it was the right thing to do. And guess what? We stood for principle, and it began with the college Republicans and the young Republicans in 1963. And we took on the Rockefeller folks and all the big money people, and I remember guys my age on the Rockefeller side, boy, they had fancy paid jobs, and they had all the money they needed. We were begging and borrowing to get our forces to advance the cause of conservatism. We were sort of rubbing 2 nickels together. But guess what? It was the young people who took over the Republican Party, first with the Young Republicans in '63, then in 1964, when Goldwater defeated the Rockefeller crowd. And yes, we lost, but out of that came the emergence of a man I later would work for, Ronald Reagan. I went off, I enlisted in the Army, served in Vietnam. I was what you call an oxymoron, Army intelligence officer in Vietnam. But I saw then, you know, the effects of the McNamara civilian whiz kid crowd back in Washington with a strategy that was doomed to failure. And I got uninvolved in politics, got married, but decided after the fall of Saigon, look at all those lives lost, all that effort for that kind of outcome, became involved again. We were part of the Reagan Revolution. Again, it didn't look very fashionable. It wasn't very fashionable even in 1976 to be a conservative, or in 1980. But Reagan won, and we put a group of people in office. It was a group of outsiders who came to Washington to drain the swamps, and we did a pretty doggone good job of it in our first term. I was asked by the President to head a federal agency. It was the most liberal agency, I believe, in the federal government at the time. It was the old OEO agency that became Action when I got there. And that agency was funding the Alinsky crowd to the tune of about $20 million a year. I decided we're going to defund that. My predecessor was a guy named Sam Brown, who was part of the original student radical movement, which morphed into the Alinsky movement. We defunded that bunch. We did more with less. Don't tell me you can't cut government spending. We cut the budget by 25%, the bureaucracy in half, and our motto was doing more with less. I came back to Texas, got back into the private sector, worked with a venture capital company for a number of years. I was involved in turnarounds of businesses that were in trouble. I got involved in 1994 when I saw a top-down structure in the Republican Party. We took the Republican Party from a minority to majority status. We put the conservatives back together. We all know we're individualists. We disagree between and among ourselves, but principled conservatives, libertarians, and traditionalists can work together. We were able to do it during the Reagan years. We were able to do it during the time when I was party chairman. And then, unfortunately, and I went back to business, got out of things, and then was asked to come back into government and chair the Texas Workforce Commission. And I began to see that the same problems we faced in the party had seeped into state government, a top-down structure, the power of big money, the power of Austin insiders, and almost a pay-to-play climate that had developed in this state. And I think back to the words of Barry Goldwater, our job as conservatives is not to represent big business, big labor, or big government. They got plenty of folks taking care of their interests. Our task is to represent the forgotten Americans and middle-class taxpayers who don't have lobbyists in Washington and aren't looking for loopholes in the law. And so I got involved, in fact, Mike said earlier, he talked about a hand up, not a handout. Well, you think, gosh, it's a mess at the federal level, and I do believe the central issue of our time is the growing centralization of power. In Washington, D.C., reference was made to the NSA surveillance business earlier. This incredible increase in concentration of power that has taken place. So far removed from the principles of federalism and the 10th Amendment, powers not expressly granted to the federal government are reserved to the states or the people respectively. We believe once in checks and balances, separation of powers, and as Dave said earlier, keeping powers local wherever it's possible, returning power from the federal government to the states and local communities. We've gotten so far away from that. But even here in Texas, I came back into office as chairman of the Texas Workforce Commission, and there was this elitist top-down educational system pushing everybody to go to a four-year university, sort of a one-size-fits-all approach. And the architect of it is a guy named Sandy Kress, who was the architect of No Child Left Behind, a liberal Democrat running our education system in Texas. And all you got is unfunded federal mandates, unfunded state mandates, and the teaching to the test mindset, which gave us the TOS test and the TOX test and the STAR test. Literally, I had a fourth grade teacher come up to me in the Panhandle not too long ago. She said, Tom, I'm trying to teach these kids the basics of reading and writing and mathematics, and I'm forced to teach to these tests, and here's what I'm teaching fourth graders. We got a multiple test, a multiple choice test here. If you don't know the answer, but you know that A is not the answer, guess B, C, or D. Now that is not real learning, that's test learning. And this is the kind of nonsense that is going on in the STAR test and By the way, a company called Pearson has a contract in excess of $450 million, and the fellow that put this educational system in place, Sandy Kress, is a lobbyist for Pearson and Caucus. Well, we took the fight on. I wasn't real popular. I even wasn't real popular at the governor's office. We decided we believe in local control of education. We once believed in it. Don't we as conservatives still believe in it? I believe in the idea of a hand up and not a hand out. And yet a lot of kids were dropping out of our schools because they weren't given an opportunity for vocational and technical education. A coherent sequence of the courses that would allow them to have an industry certified credential or a license by the time they got out of high school. And so we fought to change things, and we just got passed House Bill 5, which does three things. Number one, multiple pathways to a high school diploma, recognizing one size doesn't fit all. The beginning of a return to local control of education, which we as conservatives once believed in, I still believe in, and greater opportunities for more emphasis for those students who are interested in vocational and technical education. We've got a shortage of skilled workers. Average age of a plumber is 56, of a welder 55, stonemasonry craftsman 69, and yet we're choking off the pipeline of skilled workers with this incredible neglect, almost integration of vocational education. It shows what we can do. Let me give you a few examples of what we're not doing here in Texas. I don't know how many of you, most of you I'm sure, are familiar with our school finance system. I believe local property taxes should stay local. Then we got this Robin Hood tax scheme, which I led the effort against when Ann Richards tried to put it in with a constitutional amendment in 1993. We defeated it by 2-1. She put it in legislatively. 2 governors later, it's still there. And Greg Abbott, the Attorney General, defends it as legal and constitutional, even though it takes $1.1 billion from 374 districts and ships them elsewhere, with no accountability and no local control of property tax. And the reality is, it is in violation of the Texas state constitution, which says you can't have a statewide property tax. That's exactly what it is. And I've said we'll put a coalition together and we'll find a better way to fund the property for districts than taking $1.1 billion from certain districts and shipping it elsewhere. It's the principle, it's not the principle of the American Revolution, it's the principle of the French Revolution. To bring people up, you've got to bring others down. This is not conservatism. This is egalitarianism, and this is what current Attorney General has defended and supported in the time he's been in office. We got this kind of crony capitalism that's out there. You know, I'm old enough to remember when we had a toll road between Dallas and Fort Worth, and once you paid it off, it became a free road. Now you're taking free roads and turning them into toll roads, and we're subsidizing, we the taxpayers, are subsidizing some of these deals. It reminds me of the bailout of the too-big-to-fail financial institutions in 2008. It's called privatization of the gain, socialization of the risk. If the deal works out, the credit derivative traders, they got all the benefits. If it didn't, you put it onto the American taxpayers, as you did with the $80 billion AIG bailout to make the credit derivative traders whole. My view is if they're too big to fail, they're too big. But we got into that trap, and it started with Clinton, continued with Bush, but it's going on here in the state of Texas under ostensibly a Republican administration, and it's rubber stamped by my opponent in this race who's gone along with these deals. I don't know if you realize it or not, but if you traveled on SH 130, the toll road from Georgetown down to Seguin, I don't know quite why they picked that route, but it's underwater. And we, the taxpayers, are on the hook for over $400 million. And guess what? What happens if it goes bankrupt? And I don't have an objection to toll roads, private toll roads, or public-private toll roads, but as long as they pay for themselves. But if private companies want to get involved, guess what? They're on the hook if it doesn't turn out well. So they better plan well and ahead. But I just don't like this idea of selling off our roads. And I think there are too many of these kind of deals that are going on. I've been critical of these sweetheart deals in the cancer fund. We got $3 billion going in the cancer fund. They're giving out $300 million a year. They've got all these commercialization grants, questionable deals. My opponent is on the board. He's been on it for 3 years, never attended a meeting. And yet he's gotten over $4 million from people who've benefited from the cancer fund deal. Now this isn't authentic conservatism. This is kind of LBJ Republicanism. You know, you take care of the big boys. Who listens to the average person? And we better wake up, or we're going to have a nasty surprise a few years from now if we lose touch with what people are saying out there in the local community and what they're concerned about. Dave alluded to it earlier. Look, I'm a gray hair. I've been very fortunate in my life, but I don't like what's ahead for our children and grandchildren. And we better build a new team, and I'm proud to say that I supported a lot of these young conservatives. I'm the only one in state government who's chairman of the Texas Workforce Commission. You can't get heavily involved, but I was permitted to endorse, and I don't endorse David Simpson. I think I'm the only one who did. I campaigned for David Simpson, and I campaigned for a number of the conservatives who won this last time. And my opponent, he either stayed out or he supported the establishment candidate. And this is what we have to do. We have to build a new conservative team. We got to understand we're going to have differences. But if conservatives learn to work together, the Karl Roves, the Carneys, the consultants want to keep us divided. The big money boys want to keep us divided. We can pull a new team together, understand we're going to have some differences, but nonetheless, we're principled people. We can get this state back on the right track because, look, we're losing our country. Texas has got to lead the way back. And I don't see the current leadership of people that are focused on raising money and being career politicians and moving up the ladder as being able to be tough enough to stand up to the left and start pushing them back. And that's, you know, rhetoric is great. It's great to get up and say, you know, I'm against Obamacare. But can't we think creatively here in Texas how to make it difficult for them here in Texas? Can't we think creatively, and why weren't we involved in trying to get a waiver on Medicaid back when we had a Republican from Texas as president? Rhode Island gets one, we don't, to allow us to do what we need to do here in Texas. And we got all this mess now with the redistricting and with the Department of Justice and the voting rights case, which unfortunately was botched, and I don't know why it hasn't been yet covered by the press, by the current Attorney General and by his office, the way they mishandled it in San Antonio, the way they mishandled it in D.C., stupidly going to the D.C. Court of Appeals where we got a ruling against us, which allows them to come back in, even with the Shelby County case that's out there on Section 4 and Section 5. This is not thinking ahead. But where was Greg Abbott in 2005 when we had a Republican from Texas in the White House, Republican-controlled Senate and House, and we were in total control? And why didn't somebody go up there and say, don't put Texas under the jurisdiction of a bunch of bureaucrats at the Department of Justice for another 25 years? That's not leadership. And it's nice to put an op-ed, a piece out in the Washington Times attacking Eric Holder, but where were you, Greg? Back then when you needed to provide leadership. I give you a little example. When I was defunding the left in the Action Agency, and it wasn't a pleasant experience, I'd have probably once a week a left-wing reporter come in trying to catch me saying the wrong thing, defending, and we had to go about it in a very effective way to eliminate the funding for the Alinsky group. And I got some negative press during the period of time, but it didn't cause us to change our goal of making sure that tax dollars weren't used for a left-wing political group, and we did it. But Brad Reynolds, I remember, who was then the head, Assistant Attorney General of the Voting Rights Division of the Department of Justice. Now this is when Ronald Reagan was president. He came over to my office and said, I don't know how you defunded the left and got rid of all these bad groups, but I got the most liberal bunch in my division at the Department of Justice. This is 1981, and he wasn't ever able to get it fixed. And imagine under Obama administration what they're doing. And the point is, we should have gotten Texas out from under that back in 2005. And I think that this is a time, look, I understand the odds. He's the $25 million man. He's got a ton of money, and the rhetoric sounds good. And I probably would have, before I got back into government, said, oh, Greg Abbott's fine. But I've seen too much up close. This is not real conservatism. This is not
a conservatism of the heart. This is not a conservatism that wants to take the fight to the left. It's a conservatism, a phony conservatism that reads a script and then goes about taking care of business. It's like a friend of mine says, you know what? You feed the pigeons, and we're the pigeons. You give us the rhetoric, you toss out the red meat, but on the inside, you're taking care of the people that write the $100,000 checks. And that's the kind of stuff that's going to bring us all down. I can only say, in closing, I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have. I wrote this book, Bringing America Home, and it's about how America lost her way and how we can find our way back. What happened in the post-Reagan period? How did everything fall apart? But I have a chapter in here called The Return to Constitutional Principles, and that's what I'm encouraging. I encourage people like you, grassroots conservatives and Tea Party people, people all over the state and across the nation. But listen to what Barry Goldwater wrote in The Conscience of a Conservative in 1960. 1960. That's, think of how long ago, more than half a century ago. The time will come when we entrust the conduct of our affairs to the men who understand that their first duty as public officials is to divest themselves of the power that they have been given. It will come when Americans and hundreds of communities throughout the nation decide to put the men in office who are pledged to enforce the Constitution and restore the Republic. And that is what you're about. That's what we're about as conservatives. And I really think, I know it may look to many people as though it's beyond hope. I really think there's a beginning of a movement from the grassroots up. The next conservative movement is not going to come from inside the Beltway in Washington. It's not going to come from Austin insiders. It's going to come from the grassroots up. But we've got to take our country back. We've got to move it back in the right direction. We can defeat the left. We've done it before. We can do it again, and we have to, for the sake of our children and our grandchildren, for the sake of the future of this nation. Thank you very much.
Yes,
Two short questions. What are your thoughts about the CAB bonds for school districts and also CSU?
Okay, CAB bonds for school district. These are like the California bonds. I do not like these interest-only bonds. I have real concern with regard to that with the state law effect. With regard, curriculum management is one thing. The problem is on some of the content and some of the C-scope stuff, and that's what I object to. We're not paying attention to content. Generally, Gramsci, the Italian communist, once said, if you can capture the culture, you capture the country. And it's not just some of the problems with content in C-scope. Curriculum management is important and an opportunity as a tool, but we've got to pay attention to what's going on in content. I blew the whistle a couple of years ago on an issue where out in Marshall, Texas, a friend of mine who'd been in the Reagan administration showed me a comparison of Republicans who represent totalitarianism, Nazism, Democrats represent individual rights and democracy. This is not, this is propaganda. We got rid of that. I worked with Gail Lowe to get rid of that, but there are others that have cropped up. So you've got to worry about the content and separate the content from using a curriculum management tool. Secondly, we got to worry about our universities. I talk in my book. A good friend of mine is Rob Coons, and many of you may know Rob in this room. He's a University of Texas professor. He had a marvelous Western civilization program that he put together at the University of Texas. It was even written up favorably in the New York Times. The leftist professors there didn't like it. They proceeded to kill it. Now, where was the governor in getting on the horn with the president of the university and saying, what's going on here? And this was a great program, but it was killed. Now, the good news is, and I wrote a letter as chairman of the Texas Workforce Commission. Who cares what the chairman of the Texas Workforce Commission said? It didn't do much good. As governor, I'll have, I think, a little more influence. But Lois Caucus, who's the state rep for Brenham, stood up and did, and did everything she could to get it put back into place. Al Allison's here, knows it. He was involved in that program. It was a marvelous program. The good news is, UT may have killed it, but I got Rob in touch with Ken Hance out of Texas Tech, And Ken Hance, the chancellor out there, has put in a Western civilization program in Texas Tech. This battle for ideas is so critical, and here in our state, some of our leaders are not paying attention to it. I have a quote in my book about Stanford, which once had a marvelous Western civilization program, a great program out there. Jesse Jackson led a group of demonstrators, and their chant was, "Hey, hey, ho, ho, Western Civ has to go." Literally, that's true, and they killed him. And here, okay, Stanford, left coast, California, that can happen. But in Texas, what's happened? We're not watching this. And we've got to, this is a war for the soul of our nation. And the culture matters. Yes.
Mr. Pauken, Robert Marr here, local liberty activist. One of the data points on your resume is back in the 1980s, you ran Nancy Reagan's Just Say No to Drugs campaign.
That was actually 81 when I was in the Reagan administration. It wasn't, yeah, okay. Just Say No to Drugs.
Okay. What time period were you running that?
It was 1981 to 1984. I don't know if we started, I think we probably started it in 1982. The architect of that program was Dr. Carlton Turner. Mrs. Reagan was the chief spokeswoman, and our agency implemented it, and it was designed to discourage young people from getting involved in the drug culture. An education program to have an impact on warning them of the dangers of getting involved in the drug culture.
Mr. Pauken, I have no doubt about your sincerity or your integrity, but 30 years later, have you finally figured out that the Reagan administration in the 1980s was the world's largest dealer in drugs, and that George Walker Bush, Jeb Bush, Oliver North, and Bill Clinton, and the CIA, and the Nicaraguan Contras were running drugs on a billion-dollar scale? Have you figured that out 30 years later?
Are you talking about the Arkansas deal?
I'm talking about Florida, Texas, Arkansas, Jeb Bush, compromised Clinton, Bush, and the CIA in 1994. That was 20 years ago.
What does that have to do with the Just Say No to Drugs program?
The government was running drugs while you were saying just say no to drugs. And I'm just...
Well, all I can say, I mean, if they were, it's wrong. I can simply say that program, Just Say No to Drugs, which, by the way, was supported by a broad range of people from libertarians to people who were actually liberal Democrats, had a very productive result of showing a decline in illegal drug use among young people. That was the purpose of the program, and it worked for a while. We got away from it, but I think it was a good initiative. And in fact, I see today, I think a lot of young people who get themselves involved in the drug culture don't realize that they're losing great opportunities in terms of job opportunities because they can't pay the drugs.
Mr. Pauken, do you feel that the current policy of prosecuting the users of drugs as criminals is productive?
I'm not for legalization of drugs. I'm a recovering attorney, but when I was, one of the reasons I got involved in Just Say No to Drugs program is that I represented a lot of young people in the 1970s and was able to get them deferred adjudication and get it wiped off their record. But I saw a lot of young people who wrecked their lives by getting involved in the drug culture. I'm not in favor of legalization. I'm not, there are ways to
Are you
go
opposed
about
to decriminalization?
Well, I favor deferred adjudication, but I'm not in favor of legalization of drugs. I'm just not.
Could you tell us what part of the Constitution gives the government the authority to outlaw a plant? Could you tell me that, please? Just where does it say, these plants will make illegal?
Well, what authority in the government says that you can't take the life
Ask a
of...
question.
No, I just think you have...
You're asking me a question. I ask you a question.
No, I think you have the right to regulate marijuana and declare it illegal.
And alcohol? Should we go back to,
No,
it's prohibition.
no.
I don't really think you say that this plant is illegal.
No,
So you're saying the government has
It's
more
like, well,
authority
no, I'm sorry, well, it's just like, you have the right to say that, we respect, human life, and we're gonna limit or refuse to allow abortion.
Murder is not a victimless crime. Murder is a crime against another individual. Somebody smoking dope is not a crime that has a victim.
You know, I throw suicide, what implications did you, if somebody wants to go kill himself, you just,
That's murder too under the Bible. Suicide is murder.
so,
Mr.
don't you
Pauken,
try to stop him?
I have a
Yeah.
statement.
Sure.
Thank you for the, to say no.
Right.
I have 23 years clean and sober. And because of that, I have lived longer with systemic nephritis lupus than any other person on earth as a man, not a woman. And that's what the Rheumatology Association has told me. But I do have another question for you. Would you be willing to come out to a grassroots operation, come out with us to the overpass, to impeach Obama?
Look, each has a role. Well, I'll give you an example. Alexander Solzhenitsyn is one of my great heroes, a prophetic voice. He says each of us has a different role. And he was writing a book that ultimately helped bring down the Soviet Empire. He thought to himself, well, should I go out in Red Square and unfurl a banner saying what communism is like and go get arrested? He respected people that did, but he also said, no, that's not my role. I have my role, and my role is to make sure that we turn this country around, and that in 2016, that we actually nominate and elect a conservative to the presidency, and that we begin to start taking the country back.
Well, I want to thank you for being part of the American awareness on drugs, because it made a difference for me in my life. I appreciate it.
And I understand there are differences of opinion on this issue.
I understand that you worked in intelligence in the military,
I sure did.
and I recently have become more concerned than I was before vis-a-vis the federal government's viewpoint on the Fourth Amendment, and I was wondering what you might do if elected as Texas governor in terms of cooperating with the federal government, in terms of assisting Texans maintain their Fourth Amendment.
Well, that's a good question, and let me say one of the things that I think we could do, if you look at the 10th Amendment, it says powers not expressly delegated to the federal government reserved to the states or the people themselves. Let me give you an example, which we all know about recently. The IRS going after conservative groups, and particularly there's some groups here in Texas. What does a state do if you've got overreaching federal bureaucrats? It may be EPA, it may be a Fourth Amendment issue, it may be a Second Amendment issue. Why can't we have an ombudsman here in Texas? And you've got to be very careful in identifying what cases you pick. But if the IRS or bureaucracies or other overreach, they can put people out of business, particularly small businesses and individuals. And I think that this is an area where the state has a responsibility. Again, you better pick your cases very carefully. Stand up to federal overreach. You see stuff, I just was with a prominent conservative lawyer this afternoon who almost got an Endangered Species Act case to the Supreme Court. Unfortunately, it didn't make it there. But I mean, enormous problems for our state, for private property rights. And so, no, I'm very open to, I'm very worried about the centralization of power. I think back to a nation like Germany with the Weimar Republic after post-World War I. And what happens if the currency, what happens if there's economic chaos and the currency starts unraveling? What happens if, look at what happened in Boston with that terrorist incident, and all of a sudden they're shutting down neighborhoods. And what happens if something takes place and the federal government says, we're going to come into Texas and we're going to take your guns because, you know, this is a national emergency? Well, that is not going to happen here in Texas. And people aren't going to let it happen, but this governor's not going to
cooperate if there is this overreach.
Just to follow up, would you be willing to make any comments about intelligence, specifically NSA, CIA, FBI?
Yeah, it's over, look, this whole business, what we're doing, I mean, this whole surveillance business in this Utah operation, it's way, you know, there has to be probable cause. They're looking into everybody's stuff. I'm very much concerned about that, and I would have voted with those Republicans and the Democrats that stood up against it. Mike?
Tom, it's good to see you again. I'm Mike McNamara, running for Travis County Judge, and it's good to have Jay Rice here as running for County Commissioner too. We could make a difference on the County Commissioner's Court. One of the questions that's come up, in fact, just recently had a young black couple come over and visit our house to talk to us about their parents' home in East Austin, which is surrounded by gentrification. Their property taxes have gone up inordinately, and they're having trouble hanging on to it. Another friend that I graduated from high school with was a widow lady who is having trouble keeping up with her property taxes on her home. And you talk about property rights. Is there an alternative? What can we do as on a county level to fight this?
Well, I think there are two ways. As I said, Robin Hood is a factor. You can be a poor person living in a so-called property rich district, and you're double taxed. Get rid of that. That's 1.1 billion right there. But secondly, you've got to limit increases in property taxes. When I chaired the task force on appraisal reform, we had a proposal that would cap all property tax increase at 10%. Sometimes they could run them up to 50%, and lower homestead tax increase to 5% match. Now, can you move to another system? I know that people are talking about that, but you've got to be able to, I know you can find the 1.1 billion on getting rid of Robin Hood, but you've got to have some consistency and predictability in terms of your property taxes, and literally, people are losing their homes, so I do think you've got to address it. Yes?
Texas is way behind other states on firearms. There are 40-something states that allow open carry. There are 5 or 6 states that allow constitutional carry. What would you do about that? How would you do it? Can you please specifically comment on gun-free zones, which prohibit carry guns, and on constitutional carry, which I'll define as being able to carry a gun open or concealed to no purpose necessary?
Campus carry, I would support. Open carry, there are friends of mine who Second Amendment people have different views on that. If it passed, I'd sign it, but I haven't formed an opinion on open carry, but on campus carry, I would support.
And constitutional carry, which open or concealed no permit required?
I haven't thought through that one.
Okay, so that's not something that you would support.
No, I didn't say it, I just said I
Not
haven't
something
thought
you
through it.
encourage.
Something we would sign.
No,
If
sure.
asked.
No.
So you would sign a constitutional carry bill?
Yeah, well, yeah, I want to look at, I have to say that I haven't studied that closely enough to look at.
Can I be contacted later?
Absolutely, absolutely. Yes.
You talked about the crony capitalism and the pay-to-play culture in Austin. I know speaking for myself, this last general session was a real eye-opener on that topic. What specifically can the governor do to stop that, and what are you going to do on that topic? What, two or three bullet points?
Yeah. Number one, $50 million was funded on the Emerging Technology Fund. I was in the private sector venture capital business. It's hard enough to be successful there. Public shouldn't be in it, picking winners and losers. I'd shut that down day one, apply it to, and it's gone. And also some of these sweetheart deals in the enterprise fund. If you're talking about skills training, that's fine, but they've gotten way off track, and it's too much influenced by some of the powerful forces. I would, on the cancer fund, you've got to clean that thing up dramatically, get away from all this commercialization stuff. And I would also put in place policies that say, look, you can't just, you come in here and work and then go out and lobby for some of these big entities. And you've got to give people the confidence that somebody has a chance to make his or her case based on policy reasons, not because they happen to have raised a ton of money or very close to the governor or a powerful lobbyist. Again, I worked in the Reagan administration And look, we made mistakes, I made mistakes, the president did, but I always felt that he was trying to make decisions based on what was right or wrong, not because the poll said something or the big money folks or there were some powerful lobbyists out there. And you've got to go back to that.
Thing really noticed is that as far as this stuff goes, a lot of it happens actually within the legislature, and they guard it very jealously. What specifically would you do as far as it goes within the legislature, and would you have vetoed this past budget?
Well, let's go. You're exactly right. Let me give you a specific example. I have a friend who's on the House Appropriations Committee. I don't want to refer to a private conversation, but he told me when all of a sudden they tried to get huge increases for agency heads in the House Appropriations Committee. They didn't allow it. Somehow it gets in on the Senate side and in the Conference Committee and it passes. Now that as a governor should have been a line item veto. What I would have done is you have what I call a revenue-driven budget process. How much revenue we have and we spend it all, as opposed to a budget-driven process. There is a lack of serious policy-driven proposals coming out of the governor's office. You need a strong policy office, like what we did on what became House Bill 5. We put a policy in place to go back to local control, multiple pathways to a high school degree, and more opportunities for vocational education. You've got to have good, sound policy. Get everybody in the room. There are going to be some differences. But I think that that's what's missing. The governor is kind of reacting to stuff. Like transportation, all of the money ought to be dedicated for transportation infrastructure. And you've got to distinguish between essential services and non-essential services. So I would have had a very different kind of budget and wouldn't have gotten us into this situation that we got into. But there wasn't a policy-driven approach ahead of time. Yes.
One of the few real powers we would have as governor, other than the bully pulpit, is to appoint commissioners and heads of agencies.
Personnel makes policy.
And we just saw an example where Child Protective Services took a 2-year-old from parents who had not neglected her but had merely smoked pot and were reported by a neighbor. And that child was put in the hands of a murderer who bashed her head in. So what I would like to know is, what would be your philosophy and what would be your process for vetting heads of agencies who will actually lead instead of letting the career bureaucrats do just the same thing they always do, especially in with CPS, where they just go through the motions and don't really vet the parents, but just go through the motions and put them on this treadmill of useless things that are done that enrich all the minions that in cottage industries that are around the FPS, instead of really looking out for the welfare of children.
Well, your personnel makes policy is what I saw in the Reagan administration, and I will bring a group of policy-oriented conservatives into government here in Austin. Bureaucracy is running things across the board in all the agencies and departments, and it's kind of on autopilot. They're not paying close attention to it, and you don't have a strong policy group. I mean, there are a couple of good people in the governor's office. There's one, I won't get him in trouble by mentioning his name, but you got to have a lot of good, solid policy people, and also you got to have people that have some differences. You got to be willing to hear different perspectives.
What about accountability from the governor's office?
Yeah, that has to be. That's true. Yes.
Yeah, I did read your book. I enjoyed it. One of the things you posted on Facebook was about the growth of government, the Texas government from 2001 to now. It increased at 92%, correct? I believe you have.
Faster than the federal.
Yeah. Okay, and I'm all in agreement with you about getting rid of the emerging enterprise fund, but you're going to have to do real cuts. I mean, Texas government grew slower under Bush and the Democrats than it is under Kerry and the Republicans. And I just don't see the Republicans serious about cutting government, and you have to be cutting big chunks or completely getting rid of programs and
Here's what,
departments.
you've got to determine what are the essential services and fund those, and what are the non-essential services and defund those. I would like to see something akin to what we did in the Reagan administration with the Grace Commission, where you bring in a group of civic and business leaders as part of a transition team. They look at all of the agencies and departments, see where there could be consolidation, savings, and efficiencies, and then implement them. We did it at our agency. Some other agencies were not necessarily, they didn't necessarily do that, but Texas needs something like that. But we've got to fund the essential services, and we've got a lot of things that are being funded, and a lot of waste that's there. And I've seen it, agencies I've been associated with. Yes.
Mr. Pauken, I don't mean to backtrack, but you expressed that you support criminal laws against drugs, which I'm sure could be a good idea if managed properly, but do you support such laws when they specifically, do you support such laws when they result in the violation of a person's constitutional rights, specifically the 4th, 5th, and 8th Amendments of the Constitution? Thank you.
Well, no, I don't believe in violation of constitutional rights, but I'm not in favor of legalization of marijuana. Yes, Dave?
All right, I got a question. Has a little bit to do with drugs, not directly necessarily. Right now, almost 2/3 of the population of prisons in Texas is made up of nonviolent offenders arrested for drug crimes. That's resulting in us giving an awful lot of money in crony capitalism to companies like Wackenut at the behest of my representative, Donna Dukes, who lobbies for them while she holds the job in the legislature.
Was that right?
Yeah. Because apparently in Texas you can be a lobbyist and a legislator simultaneously. There's no penalty. And she's not the only one doing it. So,
I think you have to look at that issue.
well, at $40,000 a person, is an awful lot of money.
No, I think you've got to look at that, and I think there's some real problems in our penal system in the state, and you've got to take a look at it. I don't want to go off that time, but I've heard a number of anecdotal stories that concern me, and you've got to get the right people to take a look at it. It's like state government's on autopilot, and it's sort of like doing business. We've done it this way for 10 years. I saw that on education, so we're going to continue to do business. Now, you've got to take a look at that. And I'm not for, just because I'm not for legalization of marijuana doesn't mean I'm for putting, I do have concerns about pushers, but offenders, I went out of my way, and I was successful in getting it wiped off the record, but I don't believe in legalization.
Well, sending drugs to jail for life isn't the only way.
No, that doesn't require legalization. I mean, there's other steps that can be
Well,
taken.
deferred adjudication is it's off the record. I don't see, I think if you have.
That would be
It would not be an issue of legalization if the government had not usurped the authority to legalize, to make it illegal. None of their business.
But even under Governor Texas, it's federal law.
Can you share with us a little bit about your thoughts on the immigration issue and what we can do from a state government standpoint to address it?
There's a lot we can do. In fact, I take the $50 million from the emerging technology fund, eliminate it, and address border security. There are two aspects to it. There's a lot of technology out there now. You don't have to build additional fence that would allow us to identify people well in advance of crossing the border. I have no confidence in Janet Napolitano, the outgoing Homeland Security and Homeland Security in terms of securing our borders. There are ways legally for us to take action. My opponent suddenly is concerned about it. He's been Attorney General for 10 years, done nothing about it in that capacity. I think you also have to address the problem of the drug cartels and the kind of money that is involved, and that's a separate effort, but I think it has to be addressed. There was a hit recently in, of all places, South Lake, up in the mid-cities of someone connected with the drug cartels. There's a ton of money associated.
Is the money not involved in the drug cartels because of the fact that the government has made it illegal? And the prohibition work, is that what we prescribe for social
I'm
problems?
just not for legalism. I mean, I understand we have a difference. I'm not for legalization.
You can beat on the fence
I can't tell you what I know you want to hear. I just don't believe.
Well, I appreciate that, I appreciate that.
I mean, I really do have some concerns, and I want to discourage young people from getting involved in the drug culture. I don't think it's good for them. And I've seen the economic consequences for young people that get trapped in it and wind up losing both jobs. Yes.
One of the, another power that you will have as governor, that at times in the past, Governor Perry has used, he didn't use it at all this past session, is the power to declare emergency legislation at the start of a general session. One of the nice things about that power is that it allows a lot of the shenanigans that they use to kill good legislation. They can't use them. It makes it a lot, things don't get killed in calendars when the governor declares something emergency legislation. How will you use that power specifically? And if elected, would you use that for the Texas budget compact that was proposed about a year ago?
I would, your question's a very good one, and you've got to pick which issues you would pick. I would submit actually a budget. I mean, I think we would put together a budget that we would submit. I don't know that you have to do that on emergency legislation. I would say in terms of school finance, I could see, you know, assuming that you could put together in the transition all of the elements of an alternative to the existing Robin Hood school finance scheme, I would like to see that. My goal would be to eliminate that as governor in the first session, and so that would be one I would see that would be a top priority. I could also see border security issues. I think you've got, one thing I learned in the Reagan administration, you got to pick a few. You can't try to do everything, and you pick a few, and you obviously have some priorities. But clearly, reducing the property taxes and this double taxation and finding a better way to fund property poor districts would definitely be an issue that I would want to make sure something's done about. And also this transportation issue, trying to prevent benefits, obligations put on the taxpayers for some of these deals. I think you've got to, those are two that I would see immediately. Yeah.
In terms of regulation, I was surprised to understand that in Texas, I think maybe as many as 40% of the people are working under licenses. There's so much licensure in the state. For instance, now you have to be a licensed professional to do interior decorating.
They couldn't even get that bill.
Now I happen to be a chiropractor, and I would prefer that we were not regulated by the state because the regulation actually causes problems for me and what I would like to, how I'd like to help my patients. So can you please address what I consider grossly excessive regulation beyond most states here in free old Texas?
Right, that's Mary Lou, could you comment on your own personal experience? She's just been through one.
I will. I don't mind commenting on it. My name is Mary Lou Serafine. I ran for state senate in 2010. I think I was here when I spoke with this group. I greatly appreciated the support. And the State Board of Psychology issued a cease and desist order against me during the campaign, saying that I could not refer to myself as a psychologist, which I am by virtue of my research and prior academic training and service on faculties. I could not refer to myself as a psychologist in the course of my campaign and on my political website. So I am represented by local counsel and by the Mountain States Legal Foundation and have brought a First Amendment case against the Psychology Board, and we're in process of that.
Let me eat my hamburger before it gets too cold, and I'll be happy to
Let me follow up. I just have to say this for legal purposes. I'm sorry I said I'm a chiropractor. I'm not a chiropractor. I actually have an inactive license in the state of Texas, and I will not treat you if you want me to treat you. So don't repeat